For one, why is Ben just now giving Peter a lecture about power and responsibility? You'd think in the last few years, Ben would have explained to Peter by now why it's unwise to abuse your gifts, whatever those gifts are. And for another, the line, just because you can do something doesn't give you the right to, is undercut by the fact that Flash Thompson tried to fucking murder him. Yeah, it was a misunderstanding, but obviously Flash Thompson wanted to kill him for it. When Ben gives Peter the power and responsibility speech, the only information he has to go on is that his nephew got into a fight with a bully that he shouldn't have been able to walk away from, but apparently never bothers to ask why or if he's on drugs. It never seems to occur to Ben to ask Peter for his side of the story. Furthermore, what does being responsible with power have to do with whether or not Peter had the right to defend himself? Especially when he has no good reason to assume Peter has any power. Is Ben giving him that speech because he knows Peter is about to graduate, or does he really assume that Peter has more power than he knows and doesn't know his own strength? If the idea is supposed to be that Ben wants to make sure that Peter won't become a bully like Flash Thompson, that'd be one thing. Although I'd still expect him to ask Peter why that fight happened or how he managed to walk away from it unscathed, on top of all the other things Peter does during that fight. I mean, we the audience know that Peter is now a metahuman with spider powers, but Ben doesn't know that. You'd think Ben would have the decency to ask Peter, why did Flash Thompson want to beat you to death? Oh, and by the way, how the heck were you able to send him flying across the freaking hallway outside the cafeteria with one punch to the chest? And also, are you okay? But Ben acts like he's talking about more than that. Why? It's not like Peter sent Flash to the hospital. At most, all Flash got was a sprained wrist. Considering how Peter behaves later on in the trilogy, I'd say that Thompson got off easy. Harry Osborn, in the only bit of competence he shows in the entire trilogy, and I mean the entire trilogy, tells Peter that was amazing. You know, like he's just as dumbstruck as everybody else is by the fact that his so-called best friend, a 6'0" bookworm, not only managed to avoid being punched in the face by the school bully who kept swinging for him, but also managed to lay his dumbass out after doing a triple axel backflip. And then it never comes up again. Yeah, sure. Later that evening, Wendy has a conversation with Peter about his fight with Flash, but like Ben, the only reason she seems to care is because Peter managed to kick his ass. Never mind where the sudden burst of strength and agility came from. So maybe, Ben, just maybe, give the motherfucker a chance to explain himself. Then there's the infamous line, with great power comes great responsibility. Fun fact. When people hear this quote, they normally associate it with Ben Parker and the Spider-Man story, but you may be surprised to hear that the quote itself predates Spider-Man comics by a few centuries. A few years ago, I found out that the power and responsibility line is actually a quote used by a philosopher from the 17th century named Voltaire, but I looked it up for myself just to be on the safe side. Voltaire is only one of a few people who have used this quote, like Winston Churchill and Roosevelt, and from what I've gathered, it's older than them. I also did some research into the meaning of the quote. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it, and I'll do my best to expand on where exactly I stand on the power and responsibility moral. But the general idea behind it is, if you know something bad will happen and you have the ability to take action, you have an obligation to take action. Or, put another way, to quote Ben Parker from The Amazing Spider-Man, if you can do good things for other people, you have a moral obligation to go out and do those things. If the power and responsibility moral needs to be in The Amazing Spider-Man, period, it feels a hell of a lot less forced than this. I bring this up to illustrate that the moral of the statement is at odds with both Peter Parker's internal values and the conversation taking place in this scene. Basically, if you can take positive action, you should, which is a good moral in theory. I'll expand on how this moral is applied in a moment. The problem is that A, most people in the real world don't have this ideology. And B, within the context of the conversation, Ben seems to be under the impression that Peter did the opposite of that, and on purpose, like Peter is the one who went too damn far, when all Peter really did was defend himself. Now, when Ben gives Peter the power and responsibility line, he says, remember, suggesting that they've had this conversation before. Maybe they either haven't had this conversation before and Ben is just now bringing it up, or they have had this conversation before and Ben just assumes that Peter has a short memory. Both possibilities make Ben seem like a jerk. Unless, again, the idea is supposed to be that Ben wants to make sure that his nephew doesn't become a bully, which is a possibility, but the problem is that Ben doesn't frame it that way. He really does seem to think that Peter went too far, and I don't understand where he's coming from. If Ben knew the full context of what happened, he might be on point, but that's not really the case. The way Ben talks to Peter, he makes it sound like Peter is the one who started that fight. without bothering to clarify why he thinks it's Peter's fault, as if Peter Parker is somehow supposed to see into the damn future or something. Which, technically he could. The spider sense is basically a glorified amp factor minus the mathematical equation, but again, there's no reason for Ben to think that's the case, unless Ben can somehow see into the future, which I don't buy for 1 second. Not by a damn sight. Because I'd think that Peter would look at Ben for all of 3 seconds before saying, "What the hell are you talking about? I just told you I didn't start that fight. Why are you talking to me like you don't believe me?" Because, of course, at the end of the day, he has no idea what the hell Ben thinks he's talking about. And maybe also because he's in a hurry and this conversation is actively preventing Peter from doing the one thing that was worth him spray painting a spider web on his sweatshirt. Trying to make some money to buy a car to impress the little red-haired girl. More on that later. Peter has about as much patience for this conversation as I would if someone accused me of starting a fight with someone who was trying to kill me, because he essentially tells Uncle Ben that he needs to back the hell off. What information does Ben Parker really have that would lead him to assume that Peter went too far? What does Ben Parker think he means when he says, "With great power comes great responsibility"? Why, just because Peter defended himself, does Ben use the word power? Is he saying that Peter shouldn't have fought back, or does he think that Peter went about it the wrong way? Wouldn't Peter also have a responsibility to defend himself or to ensure his own survival? There are some people out there who don't care if you did anything to them and will most likely try to drop you the first chance they get. Do you really want to give them that chance? All of that's a moot point anyway, because Ben shouldn't be talking to Peter about power unless he somehow knows that his nephew has powers. You'd think, first of all, that Ben would double check to make sure that his nephew has great powers before hitting him with the power and responsibility moral, or you run the risk of accidentally turning this unstable, lovesick metahuman teenager into a damn supervillain. As far as I can tell, Ben doesn't have the slightest idea why his nephew got into a fight, or even that Peter has spider powers. Like he seems to in Spider-Man 2 when Peter's powers start glitching out, because of some hippie crap, and he has a conversation with Ben in a car on a blank white void 2 years after the sorry motherfucker got shot, where he tells Peter that he has to choose between being Spider-Man and being Peter Parker. I still have no idea if that conversation actually happened or if it was in Peter's imagination, nor do I have any reason to believe that Sam Raimi knows either. I don't mean to sound like I have a V for Vendetta on Uncle Ben. I'm not saying that Ben Parker is a bad teacher, nor am I suggesting that Ben is in the wrong for trying to prevent his nephew from being a bully, again, if that's what he's doing. That's the kind of thing that a smart, wise, caring, and, dare I say, responsible parent would do, even though he's not Peter's father. What I'm trying to say is that Ben seems to be confused about what transpired at Midtown High that led to Peter Parker getting into a fight with a bullying quarterback who, need I remind you, tried to bash his skull in, and is misinformed about whose fault it is, while matter-of-factly lecturing his nephew about being responsible with powers he shouldn't know about. And even if Ben is right, where the hell does he get off telling Peter that he shouldn't have fought back? I mean, let's pretend for a moment that you don't know that Peter Parker is a metahuman with spider powers and a sixth sense. If Peter hadn't defended himself in that situation, he'd probably be in a hospital right now. He also might not be alive right now to talk to you. And even if you subscribe to the notion that just because you can do something doesn't give you the right to, I missed the part where Peter Parker defending himself is irresponsible. He may not have a right to hurt people, but he does have a right to defend himself, doesn't he? If anything, it would be irresponsible of him not to defend himself. More importantly, Flash didn't exactly give Peter time to think, so all he could do at that point was react. And yet, you tell him that he was wrong just because you can do something doesn't give you the right to.
I find your lack of understanding of responsibility with power disturbing.
Look, Ben, you seem like a nice guy, and I respect you more than most people, but your nephew came inches away from getting his head ripped off over a food accident. So I'm going to have to ask you to ease up out of my face with that. Peter didn't start that fight. He told Flash Thompson straight up, "I don't want to fight you." Flash ignored him, swung at him repeatedly, and got knocked on his ass after Peter made it abundantly clear that enough was enough. What was he supposed to have done differently? What the hell else could he have done differently? And oddly enough, that's exactly what Peter asks. What was I supposed to do? Run away? It doesn't matter who or what Peter has a responsibility to if he's not alive to live up to it, or if that responsibility doesn't include making sure he doesn't die in the process. His entire problem with Peter getting into a fight seems to be the fact that he did what he needed to do to get out of that fight, not why or how it happened. It doesn't seem like he cares all that much. And let's not screw around here. It doesn't bother me that Ben is teaching Peter right from wrong. It bothers me that Ben keeps talking to Peter like he did a bad thing when that's not what happened, and because Ben isn't really saying anything in this speech. What I think Ben is trying to say is that Peter shouldn't abuse his gifts, but again, that speech is predicated on information he doesn't have and shouldn't exist unless Ben somehow knows that his nephew is a metahuman. And Ben isn't just talking about not abusing your gifts. It's connected to that, but it's technically about whether or not Peter Parker should have fought back. It's also heavily informed by an event that hasn't happened yet. Peter letting the carjacker, Dennis Carradine, get away when he could have stopped him, which is supposed to inform Peter's character arc, but I don't think it works. Ben is right about responsibility for the same reason he's wrong about Peter starting that fight, because the plot says so. And Ben has no good reason to assume that Peter has great powers because he wasn't at the school when Peter did that triple axel backflip. But he talks to Peter like he knows that's what's going on because he's Uncle Ben and this is where he's supposed to get killed, just to drive that guilt even further and make Peter feel responsible for his uncle's death, even though he wasn't supposed to be here in the first place and Peter wanted to take the train. And Ben only wound up in this situation because he insisted on driving Peter to the library and then coming back. To be fair, Peter wasn't supposed to be here either, and he lied to his uncle and aunt about what he was doing. But Peter was in town for a specific goal he was trying to accomplish that was important to him. If Ben Parker had just stayed his ass inside and let his nephew take the damn train, he might still be alive. Or if the carjacker Dennis Carradine did manage to kill Ben, it would still be Peter's fault. It might just be a simple matter of Peter chose not to stop the robber because the wrestling manager was an asshole to him, and Peter not recognizing that two wrongs don't make a right. In Spider-Man 2, May tells Peter, "You wanted to take the train, but he insisted on driving you. If I had stopped him, we'd all be having tea at this table." And that's one of the only things she's dead right about. Now, that doesn't excuse Peter's actions that led to Ben being killed, of course, but the movie behaves like Peter is the only one to blame for that, despite the fact that Ben shouldn't have been out there in that situation in the first place. And don't give me any of that Parker luck bullshit either. What does being a Parker have to do with Ben being in the wrong place at the wrong time? These motherfuckers aren't Irish. Maybe they're half Irish in the comics, but that's not in the movie. More importantly, unlike the Amazing Spider-Man, the circumstances that led to Peter having spider powers have f*** all to do with his family name or lineage. Everything kind of happens to Peter in this movie and the trilogy, but I'll address that in a moment. Ben Parker's death in this movie is as much an extenuating circumstance as it is a consequence of Peter Parker abusing his metahuman powers, which once again, Ben had no idea was going to happen when he decided to use a Voltaire quote to get after his nephew about power and responsibility, all because his nephew got into a fight with a bully who, need I remind you, was trying to fucking kill him and managed to walk away unscathed. And it also makes Ben seem like an asshole for criticizing his nephew for something that's not really his fault. Yeah, I know, you're not supposed to start fights at school, but does Ben Parker really have to come after his nephew like that? If Ben's going to be that condescending towards Peter, then it's no wonder that he doesn't have the full story. I'm sorry, I know I'm spending a lot of time on this point, but I don't understand why Peter is in any trouble for that fight. Especially when the idea of Peter abusing his power had nothing to do with why he got into a fight with a bully. Flash Thompson attacked him for accidentally messing up his shirt. Peter responded in kind, and Ben Parker has the audacity to treat Peter like he's an asshole for it, and it makes no fucking sense. Oh, and by the way, maybe just before you're about to die in a carjacking because you didn't have the good sense to leave well enough alone, isn't the best time or place to give your nephew a lecture about responsibility just because he got into a fight you weren't there for and don't seem to know the context of with a bully who was trying to knock him the fuck out? I don't care what neighborhood and what side of New York these assholes live in. For all of Ben's talk about responsibility, that is as irresponsible as it gets. Not to mention stupid as fuck. I get that Ben is probably a religious man and probably doesn't expect motherfuckers to be as twisted as car thieves or to be as homicidal compared to psychopaths like Norman Osborn, but you'd think he'd be a little bit more street smart than this, especially since he lives in Queens. And unless Ben is supposed to be a motherfucking psychic and knows that Peter is on his way to becoming Spider-Man, that just makes him even more of a dumbass for choosing right now to criticize his nephew based on information he doesn't have. It's bad enough that Ben is all up in Peter's business about a situation neither he or Aunt May were there for, but he's also being unnecessarily suicidal just to prove a point. In New York,